being there. Are we still recording? Yes. Because of his body being there. Sorry, I just made a beepy sound. A dust. Now the dust is the metaphor there. The dust is him. Now obviously, dust to dust, ashes to ashes and all that, it takes on the language of the funeral. Okay, the funeral rites. A dust whom England bore. So he is something that England bore. England then is, next technique, personified. Makes it easier for us to respect this thing. That England bore, even though it's a homeland, and now I'm talking that England in very many ways is his mother. It bore him. It gave birth to him. Shaped him. And again, each time that we see these commas, we're going back to this think. He's really asking us to slow down with him here and think about what he's saying. And we're always, guys, going back to think this of me. This is the way that I feel about myself. Whom England bore, gave birth to, nurtured, shaped, it made me what I am. Made aware. Gave me something, made aware of what? Of my own superiority? That's maybe the way we would look at it now. Gave once, and again, all the time we are talking about stages of his being. Gave once, her flowers to love. And again, it's going back to this idea of Englishness. Her ways to roam. Freedom. That's what is represented by England. And now we think back to other poets. We think to Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Okay? This idea of this very sort of pastoral, by pastoral I mean countryside. Pastoral Georgian poetry. Okay? Her ways thrown. A body of England's. And it's almost like he's returning himself. He is sacrificing himself happily, no, but accepting the fact that if it's going to happen, I will return myself to the thing that bore me. A body of England's, breathing English air. Now, again, all this sort of softness there, the breathing here, there's a calmness to the breathing. There's an acceptance of fate, but there's also a love of his country. England, English, England, England, England. He's talking about England, the repetition of England all the time. And the idea that we have English air, and we do get down there eventually, under an English heaven. The English air is better than air anywhere else. Because England is better than anywhere else. And an English heaven, ultimately, will be better than anywhere else. Because it's English. Is this simply propaganda that he's been sold? Is this the old lie? Washed by her rivers. Now again, the idea of England personified washing him, almost this idea of purification. Almost, I would say, an idea of religious connotations to it. Remember, connotations, associations, baptism. Almost England baptizing him. Blessed by the sons of home. There's a godliness to England. Being blessed by England. Washed by England. Breathing English air. And the very essence of him, think only this of me, he's a body of England. And in that way, even though he says a body, there is a spirit to this. Now this is the whole point, isn't it? What Hardy would say in A Wife in London, what Owen would say in Dulce Decorum Est, when you see a man coughing up his lungs or a man being eaten by worms, we take on a very, very organic, bodily, physical thing. But of course, what Brooke is saying, that as people, as humans, the thing that makes us different from animals is the fact that we have a spirit. Something more than simply the physical. Wilfred Owen would argue that if you've seen what I've seen, you'd realise that people are just physical things because they're bits of meat that can be blown apart. Now remember the irony of this, ultimately what happened to him. He was killed by what? A mosquito. And again, the repetition. Think and think. We've got the pause here. Do you remember yesterday I said in between stanzas? If you can actually say, right, pause here represents something. And it's almost like an epiphany. A moment, a realization. And think, this heart, all evil shed away. At the moment of death, we said about this being almost like a confession. We said about this idea of washed by rivers. At the moment of death, he is pure. All evil shed away. A pulse in the eternal mind, no less. Okay? Heartbeats, we link the pulse with the heart. But think about why, again, this was such a good piece of war propaganda at the beginning of the war. Because what is he saying? The Englishness will last for how long? Where the German war machine had this idea of the Reich, and we know about the Third Reich from the Second World War, but this is the Second Reich. The idea that it would go on forever. But he is saying in a different way, because of Englishness, because of England and that thing that instills in all of us who are English, that it'll go on forever. That mindset is an eternal thing. No less gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given. And what makes it eternal is because in dying it goes on and on and on. England gives, we take it, we become English, and in dying for England, an English body, it perpetuates and goes on and on and on. And that's what makes England great, and that's what makes us English. And we go on from not just talking about England in terms of this physical entity, not just in terms of the words and ideas, but what do we have here? Her, so we're clearly saying it's a her who has nurtured him, born him. Her sights and sounds. Okay? What are we talking about, the English sights and sounds? The babbling of a brook, the willows rushing on that water. I don't know. Okay? The things that make Englishness so English. When I mentioned the poet Edward Thomas, when someone said to him, why are you going to fight in the First World War, he picked up a clod of English soil and went, literally for this. Dreams, happy as her day. So the days in England were happy, and dreams of them are happy, a happiness. And laughter, learnt of friends. That sums up Englishness and gentleness. And there's one thing that you can say about this poem, for all the violence that comes after it in terms of the war, not necessarily his death, which wasn't a violent death, but the violence which comes after it in terms of the war, as experienced by the likes of Wilfred Owen and so on, this is a very gentle poem. It's a soft poem. It's a poem of consideration. I said that, it's a poem of blissful acceptance of being. And there's full of pauses. Look at all the pauses in there. Of thought and consideration and calm and gentleness in hearts at peace. At the moment of death, a heart at peace. Because it's going to heaven. And better than going to heaven, it's going to an English heaven. Okay? Now, obviously there's a lot that I've given you in terms of that poem, but you can see why I've sort of justified that it is a poem in its own right, a good poem in its own right. I say it's a poem in its own right. Obviously we may agree with the sentiment of it now, but where it is such a good poem is obviously if you were to get a question as that as your named poem, be able to write about that. And I've said to you so many times, even though I've sort of given you this idea of doing your write-ups in a very, very structured way, if you're going to get the higher grades, you need to understand the sentiment and emotion of things, particularly in poetry, because what's written down on the page there is absolute feeling. And every dot and every word and every piece of punctuation and every choice of how it is structured, whether it's enjambed or caesura or whatever it might be, and even a break in stanzas, is there for a reason. as, if you like, an evocation, if you like, a representation, a reflection of emotion. And this is an emotion where, yes, and how could we possibly say there is a single way that one might feel? There's a part of Wilfred Owen which was thought of the honour of war before he actually realised the gritty reality of it. And even at the end, he might have thought about, when I've discussed it with you guys, there is an honour to war. Yes, there is, even if it's horrific. And there is a fear and uncertainty in this poem, if I should die. But there is an acceptance as well, and in that acceptance there is the calm and the gentleness and all the metaphor and the symbolism that goes with it, let alone how it performed it, whether we disagree with its content or not. Okay? And the other thing I'd say, that when we've got that repetition there throughout it, the England, the THs, the softness of it, it's almost like a chiming bell for me. There's a rhythm. We have the rhythm in there. We have a rhyming scheme. Look, A, B, B, C, and so on. We have the rhyming scheme. And in that we have our metre and our stresses. If I should die, think only this of me, that's a chorus of fine fields, and so on. But there's also peppered throughout it these chimes, these little laments, these sort of moments of death is coming. And not bring it on in a jingoistic way, but if death is coming, then death is coming. And I'm ready for it, because I know where it will send me. The other thing that makes the poem so good to comment on is, like I said, after that last full stop, the sentiment and the ironies of it, how he died, how we might choose to compare it. And when we actually come to look at how we compare essays in the future, there's a great deal, obviously, we can say, particularly with Wilfred Owen. Both men who were soldier poets, more so Wilfred Owen, both of whom were there, both of whom were killed in war. The massive point, though, is that look at the way Wilfred Owen died, even though he was so staunchly against, by the end of it, fighting. But look at the way that he died, when part of him was so accepting that it might happen. And there's deep, deep tragedy in that. Deep tragedy, as there is in any war poem, but for me, particularly deep tragedy in that. Anyway, look, I hope that's given you something. Pause it as you need to, make your annotations. If there's anything you want to contact me about, an explanation of it, do so. I hope you've enjoyed that poem, but I hope you've understood the depth of it.